Welcome back to a history class with Dr. W and our continuing study of the year 1968. In the last few lectures, we've looked at some of the deep background of 1968 in the decade of the 1950s. In the next few lectures, we'll look at some of the more immediate background causes of the events of 1968 by examining the decade of the 1960s. The generation graduating high school in the mid-1960s endured the Cuban Missile Crisis, the assassination of John F. Kennedy, the race riots of the mid to late 1960s, and the deepening of the Vietnam War. It's no wonder they were ready to explode by 1968. As the Eisenhower administration drew to a close, John F. Kennedy was elected the new president in the 1960 presidential election. He was youthful, charismatic. He was the first Catholic to run for the presidency since Al Smith in 1928. He was a decorated World War II hero and the author of a Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Profiles in Courage. His father, Joseph Kennedy, was a wealthy businessman and ambassador under Franklin Roosevelt. Kennedy served 3 terms in the House and part of 2 in the Senate. Still, he would be the youngest president elected to that point. His youthful, energetic image concealed the fact that he was beset through much of his life by a variety of illnesses that required medication. His running mate was Lyndon Johnson, the master politician from Texas, who we'll talk much more about later in this course. His opponent in the election was Richard Nixon. Ideologically, they weren't terribly different. Both appealed to the center of their parties, and both were focused on Cold War issues. But Kennedy was much more dynamic. Kennedy's Catholicism, youth, and inexperience made it a close race. The difference, as I mentioned in a previous lecture, likely came down to a series of televised debates. In those debates, Kennedy appeared on television as confident, witty, and cool. Nixon appeared uncomfortable, edgy, and nervous. Kennedy prevailed in a razor-close election, 34.2 million votes to 34.1 million. And in the Electoral College, he won 303 to 219. Ultimately, the assassination of Kennedy in November of 1963 marked a dividing point between the era of consensus, peace, and prosperity to the era of protest of the 1960s. But Kennedy's presidency itself experienced considerable upheaval, both domestically and abroad. Kennedy promised a new frontier, a struggle against tyranny, poverty, disease, and war. He was a tremendously appealing and charismatic figure. He was perfect for the age of television. He was youthful and charming. He had a beautiful wife, Jacqueline Kennedy, and the couple exuded grace, elegance, and style. The Kennedy White House came to be called Camelot, after one of Kennedy's favorite musicals, but it also brought to mind the era of white horses and gallant knights. Kennedy surrounded himself with a group of brilliant young intellectuals, scholars, and captains of industry. Not the least of them was his brother, Robert Kennedy, whom he appointed the Attorney General, and we'll talk much more about Robert Kennedy later in this course on 1968. He plays a very important role. There was a belief within the administration that progress in this age could eliminate social ills. Prosperity on the home front could satisfy everyone. On the home front, Kennedy did accomplish some improvements. He extended unemployment benefits, raised the minimum wage, and increased the defense budget. He also approved a $4 billion federal housing measure and doubled the budget for NASA. He had a great interest in the space program, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in our discussion of 1968 itself. In general, this kind of government spending goosed the economy and increased prosperity throughout the decade. But on the whole, Kennedy dealt with a divided Congress. He struggled to get things passed. He wasn't as skilled as Lyndon Johnson in ushering acts through Congress, and Congress passed only 7 of the first 23 bills he submitted. Kennedy was also tested by the struggles of the civil rights movement on the home front throughout his presidency. Overall, he was cautious on the issue of civil rights, not wanting to alienate white Southern congressmen and voters. We'll talk much more about this period of the civil rights movement in a future lecture. And on the whole, it's important to note that while we now know Kennedy would not live to see the end of his first term as president, that much of his only term as president was spent thinking about re-election, and he had to worry about alienating certain groups and regions of the country in his concern over winning re-election in 1964. Kennedy's presidency might be better remembered for his issues involving foreign affairs. His presidency developed what was called the flexible response, trying to add some flexibility to the more rigid policies of the Eisenhower administration and its reliance on nuclear weapons and more bang for the buck, as I described in the last lecture. Under Kennedy, the process of developing nuclear submarines, ballistic missiles, and a variety of weapons continued. He increased assistance to various troubled parts of the world. He created the Alliance for Progress, which promised development for Latin America, and the Peace Corps. He increased training for paramilitary forces and special forces. And as he said, "We intend to have a wider choice than humiliation or all-out war." And yet he met a variety of struggles in terms of foreign relations, particularly those revolving around Cuba. His presidency was marked by the Bay of Pigs, the failed invasion of Cuba and the attempt to overthrow Castro, tensions in Germany and the construction of the Berlin Wall, and the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962. And it's under Kennedy that much of the early period of escalation in Vietnam proceeded, and we'll talk much more about this early period of the American War in Vietnam in a later lecture. In November of 1963, Kennedy traveled to Dallas for the early stages of campaigning for the 1964 presidential election. There, shots were fired as his motorcade wound its way through the city. Kennedy was hit twice, once in the head and once through the throat. He died within a half hour. His assassination marked the end of an era, as I mentioned a little bit earlier. Perhaps because of that, it's also become something of a national obsession. As in the wake of 9/11 and various other events, news reports ran 24 hours a day for days after the event, with updates all along the way. Thus, 2 days after his death, the nation watched live on television as his assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, was himself shot at point-blank range by Jack Ruby. The nature of Kennedy's assassination has been a source of tremendous speculation by historians and other interested parties. That such an important act could be carried out by one madman is somehow unsatisfactory, and conspiracy theories have abounded. The 1992 Oliver Stone film JFK demonstrated a number of those theories, involving Lyndon Johnson, the CIA, the FBI, and the Pentagon in a massive tangle of conspirators. The latest evidence, though, does support the thought that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. Kennedy was a revolutionary president. He's usually ranked by historians somewhere in the middle of the pack in ranking the presidents, something around 22nd or 23rd. But he is much beloved and remembered well beyond his accomplishments. His youth, his charisma, his family, and the Kennedy mystique all contribute to this. The role of television contributes to it as well. He was also a tremendous speaker and made many television appearances speaking directly to the American people. He had a similar connection to the people as Franklin Roosevelt a few decades earlier. Finally, the assassination of Kennedy was such an indelible event that he has become almost deified in death. In the aftermath of the assassination of Kennedy, the 1960s grew chaotic and violent. We recalled the Kennedy years with fondness, years as peaceful and idyllic, even if that image might be exaggerated somewhat in hindsight. After Kennedy, Vietnam, the Civil Rights Movement, urban rioting, and later Watergate and other episodes shattered our sense of idealism, and hope for the future faded. This is the world that the so-called 1968 generation came of age in. In our next lecture, we'll talk about the man who is going to be president during the year 1968, the focal point of our semester, Lyndon Johnson.